Welcome, everyone. We're going to give folks just a moment to join and then we'll get started. So happy to have you here. All right, well, we will go ahead and get started so we can use our time very effectively today. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Taking Action, Assisting Older Victims of Financial Fraud. We are delighted to have you join us today. A few housekeeping things to note before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. If you have any concerns about your privacy, we ask that you don't type in the chat. The recording and evaluation and any materials will be shared in the post-discussion follow-up email in the next few weeks. You should be able to hear me, but I shouldn't be able to hear you. If you cannot hear us or have any technical issues, please send a message to Dash Coleman or Robin Evans. Unfortunately, we are not able to give out certificates for your attendance today. We do have live captions available for today's session. To turn on live captions, select the Show Captions button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, which can be accessed by clicking the Q&A button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. This helps us to manage the questions and ensure we don't lose any in the chat. We will address all questions at the end of the presentation. Hi, everyone. My name is Kim Camacho, and I am a program manager with the National Center for Victims of Crime. I'm a licensed master social worker, and I have experience working with older adults, victims of crime, and offering training and technical assistance to victim service professionals like many of you. I'm delighted to be joined today by our partners from FINRA to discuss the impact of financial fraud on older adults and how service professionals can assist victims and help prevent future fraud. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert for his introduction.
Great. Thanks, Kim. Hi, everybody. Rob Massio. I'm a director with FINRA's Office of Investor Education and the FINRA Foundation. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on exactly what all that means, in case you don't know, but really excited to be joining you all today to talk about taking action, what we can do to assist older victims of financial fraud. We're going to go through a lot of different content, and kind of the genesis of this training is based off of a taking action guide, an advocate's guide to assisting victims of financial fraud that the FINRA Foundation and the National Center for Victims of Crime have worked together to put together. So if anybody hasn't seen that guide, by all means, I'd highly recommend you taking a look at that. We do have places where you can download that in PDF form, as well as requesting a hard copy version. But this training is designed to kind of give a little bit of information about that guide and talk to you about what we can do to assist victims of financial fraud. So if there's questions as we go through, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and Kim and I will do our very best to make sure that we respond to those questions. So I alluded to it. Who is FINRA? What do we do? And what's the difference between FINRA and the FINRA Foundation? So FINRA stands for the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. We are a private, not-for-profit regulator. We are not a government agency, but we were put in place, we were authorized by Congress to regulate the securities market, to regulate brokerage firms. We are overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission, so they make sure that we are doing the job that we were put in place to do. But again, we are not a government agency. The overall mission of FINRA is investor protection and market integrity. We go about that through a variety of different mechanisms, including examinations of brokerage firms and their employees, reviewing customer complaints, facilitating an arbitration and mediation function, and educating consumers about financial literacy and financial fraud. Now, the FINRA Foundation is a wholly owned subsidiary of FINRA, and we focus our efforts on building financial capabilities for all Americans. And we do that through two kind of distinct ways. We focus on building wealth. So what can we do to build the wealth for individuals? How can we educate them on that financial capability piece? But then hand in hand with that is the protecting wealth. So there is a financial capability side to that. What can we do to make sure that people that their assets are protected, and that they know how to identify, spot, and avoid financial fraud. And if they are victimized, how can we assist them and support them? A lot of our efforts are through various types of research. So our outreach is grounded in research that we conduct within the FINRA Foundation. And we work with a variety of different partners to achieve our goals and our mission. Kim, tell us a little bit about the National Center.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rob. The National Center for Victims of Crime, also known as NCVC, is a national nonprofit that advocates for victims' rights, trains professionals who work with victims, and serves as a trusted source of information on victims' issues. Our organization was founded over 35 years ago after our founder's mother, Sunny Van Bulow, was murdered. It was after their family's experiences with the criminal justice system that our organization was born. We offer direct services through our National Victim Connect hotline and our DC-based victims hotline. And we also support victim service professionals through offering technical assistance, resources, training, and support. Our centers listed on the slide really work in tandem to ensure that the work that we do is holistic and it meets the needs of victims and those that provide them with services.
Perfect. Sorry, I was taking the time to see where everybody's from. I always like looking at the chat and seeing where everybody is from. So don't mind me if I was spacing out to the side looking at my other screen. It's great to see where everybody is coming from. Thank you for putting that in the chat. I am located in Florida, so it's always nice to see some of my fellow Florida folks. And I saw in here somebody from Salisbury, Maryland, which, fun fact, that's where I went for my undergraduate. So
amazing.
Always enjoy looking at that. So thanks for putting that in. All right, back to business. The scope of financial fraud. What do we know? These are reported, the reported statistics reported to the Federal Trade Commission in 2023. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, it's 2024, Rob. This isn't really helpful. Well, let me tell you why it is helpful. So this takes all reports that were made in 2023. Since we're still in 2024, there are reports for the first and I guess second quarter that would be in there. But we wanted to get a holistic view of what last year looked like. So what do we know? Over 2.5 million reports of fraud were reported to the Federal Trade Commission. Losses topped $10 billion. So that's 10 billion, billion with a B. 4.6 billion were lost to investment-related scams. Now, the caveat when we talk about investment-related scams, for this data source, investment-related scams can include kind of traditional investment scams, Ponzi schemes, those type of things. But it also includes crypto assets. So they combined crypto assets with other types of investment-related scams. So 4.6 billion, almost half of the money lost was due to investment-related scams. Imposter scams continues to be at the top. Identity theft continues to be a problem. So these numbers, they are staggering. They are really high. But this is only what we know. This is that tip of the iceberg, if you will. This only takes into account those that reported the scam, reported the fraud, reported the crime, not the individuals that didn't report because they were embarrassed, they were ashamed, they didn't know where to go, or frankly, they might not even realize that they had been victimized yet. So these numbers, terrible on their own. We take into consideration all those individuals that haven't reported for those variety of reasons. These numbers are going to be small compared to that overall number. Now, I don't put the slide in here to scare people. I put it in here to really kind of set the stage. So people start thinking about the number of individuals that are being victimized on a yearly basis. And when I was talking, I mentioned the 10 billion that had been lost in 2023 to financial fraud and scams. We often focus on that number. We focus on the monetary amount that was lost, but that's only a portion of the impact. So when you think about a victim, when you think about a survivor, however you want to classify that individual, they've lost money, but they're also dealing with more. They're dealing with that non-financial impact as well. The FINRA Foundation, we conducted a study and we determined that nearly 2/3 of victims of financial fraud reported experiencing at least one serious non-financial cost associated with that fraud. Now, again, these are serious to a high level. So 50% indicated severe stress. That's again, to a severe degree. Anxiety, a high level of anxiety at 44%. Difficulty sleeping, 38%. And again, that's not just, a couple nights of bad sleep, one night of bad sleep. That's on a chronic basis. And 35% were indicating that they were grappling with bouts of depression. So that financial number is important, but it's equally, if not more important, to remember that emotional impact that victims and survivors are experiencing. And we need to keep that in mind as we look for ways to assist them and to help them recover emotionally throughout this process. Which brings me to a story about Ruth. So Ruth is I'm going to say she's a survivor. And I'm going to use two different terms, and I'm going to explain why in a minute. She called our office. This was probably going to be about 4:45 on a Friday afternoon. I don't know if anybody else has been in that situation where you're looking at the clock and you're saying, it's almost the weekend, I'm ready to go. But the phone rings, decide, you know what, I'm going to pick up the phone. And on the other end of that phone was Ruth. Ruth was calling to inform us, to let us know about a situation that her and her husband were involved in. They've been interacting with an accountant for years. They own a small business, and they've been using that accountant to do the booking for that business. At a certain point in time, the accountant looked at their financial records and said, you know what, you're doing pretty well. I think I can help you do better. I've got an opportunity for you to invest with me, and we're gonna use some of that savings that you have, and we're gonna increase your assets. We're gonna grow your assets. And Ruth and her husband, Len, who's right there, said, okay, we've worked with this guy for so long. We trust him. He's been loyal to us. Perfect. Let's do it. They hand over some of their money. The accountant starts to invest. They're happy with what they're seeing as their returns. They start pulling in some of their friends, some of their families to invest with this individual as well. Time goes on. That's when everything starts to fall apart. That's when they realize that this investment that their accountant had put them in was not an actual investment. It was a scheme for that individual to access funds to his own purpose, to his own benefit. Now, Ruth and Len, they had started pulling in their friends and family, like I mentioned. So they had more than just that financial interest in this. And when they find out that it's a scam, that it's a fraud, they find out that the accountant wasn't registered to conduct securities business, things start to fall apart. Now, Ruth called us to let us know. She said, you know what? I've already reported it to the authorities. I just want to let other people know about this. Whereas Len kind of took that victim approach. He retreated. He really had those non-financial impacts associated with this fraud. He pulled himself back from friends and family. He didn't want to talk about his experience. Meanwhile, his wife, Ruth, was wanting to talk about it. So two people going through the exact same fraud, experiencing different levels of emotion. Now, I tell that story just so you can keep in mind that people approach trauma at different levels. And yes, financial fraud is traumatic. And what's traumatic to Len might not have been as traumatic to Ruth at that time. So as we're working with victims and survivors, we must remember that people experience trauma at different levels at different times throughout the journey.
Thanks, Rob. Let's talk a little bit about some of the groups and populations that scammers often target. You'll be hearing a lot from us today about older adults, so we will start there. Older adults may be targeted more frequently because scammers often assume that they are more susceptible to different types of scamming tactics. They believe that older adults are very trusting, that they may have significant financial savings and good credit. And they're also hoping that folks in this category may be more isolated, or that they have cognitive or health impairments, or they may also be potentially experiencing some financial strain, and that might be why they are targeting them. In reality, older adults make up about a third of fraud victims, and we also know that they're becoming more targeted. With the older adult population growing and financial loss of more than $3 billion every year, elder fraud is certainly a growing issue, which is why we're talking about that today. But in addition to older adults, perpetrators also may target people with disabilities, military members, communities of color, youth and young adults, or people that have been previously victimized. Those in abusive relationships may also be targeted either by their partner or other scammers. With all of these populations, ultimately perpetrators are targeting them because they perceive a certain vulnerability and their ability to exploit them. Next slide.
I just wanted to come back in. There's a few
Yeah.
questions that are in the Q&A. Continue
Great.
to put those in here. A couple were related to the statistics that were out from the Federal Trade Commission. One question was whether or not that reflected survivors of only non-intimate partner violence situations. That could be any type of report. So it could be a victim or survivor of intimate partner violence or not. So it's just the Federal Trade Commission has a mechanism for you to report financial frauds and scams, and it would be captured in there. There's a couple other agencies that feed data into that as well. So it comes from a variety of different sources, but not solely non-intimate partner violent situations. And then somebody asked if we have accurate data on suicide rates after elder financial exploitation. I don't have accurate data, but we do know that there is a correlation, not only with just elder financial exploitation, but financial exploitation or financial fraud in general. There is often, well, maybe not often, but there is a correlation between suicide and those experiences as well.
Yeah, and at the end, we'll be sharing a variety of different resources with you where you can learn more. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about how fraud happens and what are some of the risks and tactics out there. Perpetrators of this type of crime really can range from people that are close to the victim to the strangers that are far away. Perpetrators are looking for people who may be vulnerable or isolated. Perpetrators that are known to the victim might include family members, especially if they are in some sort of position of control over the victim's care, like a power of attorney, a caretaker, or an adult child or partner. They may also be members or leaders of an affinity group that the victim is a part of, such as a civic club, a religious group, or other community. These perpetrators often utilize those common interests to build trust with victims in order to effectively operate the fraud and the scam. And that's what really makes those scams so successful, is they can really build and foster that trust based on those shared interests or identities. The last type of perpetrator that is known to the victim are trusted advisors. So these might be accountants, attorneys, investment professionals, or bankers. That's certainly something we also see when it comes to folks that are targeting folks.
Right. And we also know that emotions play a large role in an individual's vulnerability. We know that when a person's emotions are heightened, their judgment could be clouded. So the FINRA Foundation, we conducted a study where we looked at brainwaves, and we looked to see how an individual's brain reacted when they were shown clearly misleading advertisements. We had two groups in the study. We had an older population and a more younger population. And we wanted to see through a series of gaming mechanisms whether or not heightened levels of emotion played a role in, again, wanting more information on these clearly misleading advertisements. And what we found was that older population, when they were in that heightened state of emotion, whether it was positive or negative, fearful, angry, afraid, excited, whatever it may be, they were more likely to engage and want to know more about those clearly misleading advertisements. Now, this was simply through a study, but we've also seen this in real life as well. Emotions play a large role, and fraudsters know that, and they try to leverage individuals' emotions to get a person to do something they might not otherwise have done. Some other factors that we know that relate to an individual's engagement. So engagement, we're talking about when there is that initial pitch, and that pitch could come from a variety of different ways, whether it's an online pitch, whether it's an over the phone, whether it's in person. Engaging, following up with that individual, or having that conversation. Higher levels of engagement were often associated with financial insecurity. So that inability to, say, come up with I don't know, $2,000 to meet an emergency need. That would be considered financial insecurity. Social isolation plays a role, and that could be social isolation in the extent that we typically think of, where a person might have nobody to talk to, but it also could be social isolation from the stance where a person puts themselves in a state of social isolation. So they might have a network or they might have family and friends to talk to, but they choose not to for whatever reason that might be. So that's another form of social isolation, self-created social isolation. And then the method in which scammers contacted people played a role. When individuals were contacted through online means, they were more likely to engage. Now, lower levels of engagement, this one I find important for me because, again, I'm in this world of financial education, knowledge about scams. The more we know about scams, how they operate, what kind of scams are out there, the better protected we are. So having those conversations, making it part of a family conversation is so important, because simply talking about the scams that are out there, how they operate, that is a protective factor. So I mentioned the social isolation played a role. This came out of a study that the FINRA Foundation worked on with the Better Business Bureau. And this was pre-pandemic. So we saw that social isolation played a role again prior to the pandemic. And this talks a little bit more about the two kinds of social isolation, the one that had nobody to talk to, as well as individuals that put themselves in a state of social isolation. Now, I mentioned emotions play a role, and some of the ways that scammers or fraudsters try to manipulate an individual's emotion is through these different persuasion tactics. I have 5 of them up on the screen here. These are what we've coined as persuasion tactics. Anybody who's done any marketing knows these are marketing tactics. These are tactics that marketers use, and marketers know that they work. Unfortunately, scammers and fraudsters, they know they work too. They know that these can be ways to manipulate somebody and to take advantage of that emotional component. The first one is phantom riches. That's that dangling a prospect of what your life would look like if you had a windfall of money. They might use terms like risk-free, guaranteed, high returns. Those are things that as an individual is hearing it, they get excited. Like, oh, that sounds great. Who wouldn't want risk-free, high returns? But we know that that's not possible in the securities world. But those words, those terminologies are used to excite emotion. Social consensus, that's the concept of, well, everybody else is doing it, you should probably do it too. So I've got young kids, and if they're invited to, a birthday party, this actually goes a little more along with the reciprocity as well. So reciprocity we see with the free lunches. My kid gets invited to a birthday party, and when they have their birthday, they're going to likely invite that kid to their birthday because they want to reciprocate that invite. Scarcity is another tactic that's used. That is using those time scarcity or quantity scarcity, saying that if you don't act now, you're going to lose out on that opportunity. Things like going fast, limited time, today only, sign on this line now, or else you're going to miss that opportunity. That's what scarcity looks like. And then the last one I'm going to touch on is source credibility. That is a method in which somebody tries to portray themselves as more trustworthy, as more credible. Source credibility is a shortcut to trust, but it can be faked. So there's a reason why at the beginning of this session, Kim and I talked about a little bit about who we are, the organization we work with, those types of things. That's to build our source credibility. So you all sitting here are saying, okay, well, maybe these two, maybe I should listen. Maybe this is something that these people can talk intelligently on, right? We were using source credibility to make sure that number of individuals attending didn't drop immediately. Fraudsters know that that works, and they use source credibility, but again, it can easily be faked. Something like, I'm a vice president of XYZ company, or I've got a corner office. That is trying to portray themselves as more credible. Another thing that we've looked at through different studies that the foundation has done is the way in which an individual's guiding narrative, so events that have happened throughout an individual's life to kind of shape who they are, how that plays a role in a person's decision-making process. And we've got these three different mental frames, if you will: compliance beliefs, opportunity beliefs, intelligent beliefs. And we wanted to try and get an understanding of whether the way a person approaches those situations, whether it made them more susceptible or more likely to engage with a potential scammer or fraudster. So compliance beliefs: do people approach a situation and say, well, compliance, it's somewhat optional, or I have a duty to comply. So when you drive down the highway, there's a speed limit sign that says that it's 55. There are people out there that say, I have a duty to comply. That speed limit was set to keep people safe, myself, other people out on the road. I will not go over 55. It is my duty to follow the rules. Whereas other people might say, well, 55, yeah, I could probably put the speed control at 61, likely not going to get pulled over for 6 over, and they view it more optional. So think about when that fake IRS agent calls and says, you owe back taxes, pay now or else I'm locking you up and putting you in jail. Those with that duty mindset, they might react differently than a person that views things from that optional standpoint. Opportunity beliefs: it's whether or not a person thinks that people have gotten to where they are because of lucky breaks or because of they put in the time, they've earned it. And then from the intelligence beliefs: are people afraid to ask questions because they're worried they're not going to appear knowledgeable? Or are they curious? They're okay asking those questions. And those individuals that had that line of thinking in the red were more likely to engage and be victimized. Another study that we worked on, this is one that we partnered with AARP to look at chronic fraud victimization. And chronic fraud victimization can be an individual who's been victimized by the same crime repeatedly, or an individual that's been victimized by a variety of different financial frauds. And we wanted to kind of look at this and see how we could disrupt the scam cycle, the chronic fraud cycle. Now, this was focused on chronic fraud, but a lot of these principles apply to fraud in general. So we have 4 different quadrants here on the wheel. We've got the situation. So that's kind of why a person is in the position to be vulnerable. We've got the trigger. So that's some kind of event that happens that triggers the individual to react. We have the motivation, and we have the ability. So what can we do to disrupt this fraud cycle? On the situational side, it's tackling chronic susceptibility, having conversations. It's something that's a little bit difficult to do. If you think about a victim of a romance scam, oftentimes that situation might be the loss of a spouse, right? So what can we do to kind of tackle that? On the trigger side, what can we do to interrupt? Can we put structural interventions in place or education so when that call comes in, the person knows not to proceed any further? Or when that interest online sends the message, they know to proceed with caution. Motivation, that's that need to feel wanted, to feel needed. And talking to individuals in the advocacy space or social work, this is an area where we can really play a large role in disrupting that motivational component. Having conversations with people that are vulnerable could mean that they're going to talk to you instead of the scammer. They're going to have their motivational needs fulfilled instead of going to a scammer to achieve that. And then ability, that's really going to be the access to funds. How can we put a buffer in place to prevent the immediate release of funds for an individual that might be victimized or chronically victimized?
Rob, before you move on to the next slide, there is a question in the Q&A that I think lines up really well with what you're talking about. Are there any helpful techniques from a psychology perspective to continue or to convince non-believing victims that they are being scammed, especially in that context of romance scams? Do you have any tips or kind of language that we might share with folks that can help them when having that conversation?
Sure. So it is a significant challenge because people want to believe what they want to believe. So as an outsider looking into the situation, sometimes it can be really difficult to convince a person that the emotions and the feelings that they're having are based off of a lie. I know oftentimes there's a lot of different literature out there that can help Oftentimes when I'm talking to say financial institutions and they're dealing with a individual who might be a victim of financial fraud, it's giving them literature for that person to read on their own so they can approach the situation from when their mind is ready to accept it. There's also support groups out there. So FINRA Foundation, we work with two different organizations that help individuals. So one is the Cybercrime Support Network, who runs a peer support program for victims of romance scams. And so that's a group of individuals that could come together and talk about the experiences that they're having. They could be a resource. I'm going to talk a little bit more about them on a later slide. And then another organization that we work with is Give an Hour, which they're running peer support programs as well as training for mental health professionals to help them understand how better to assist victims of financial fraud. So not necessarily the answer you're probably looking for, not the way to do it, but there are options that you can consider. But you also have to keep in mind that individuals going to put up a wall if they're not ready to hear it. So you might have to have the conversation more frequently than just that one time. You might have to pull in friends or family or outside individuals to help get that message across. FINRA, we have a securities helpline for seniors, and we've used that phone line as a way for a person who's experiencing some sort of a financial fraud to talk to an unbiased, separate individual about that. And sometimes having that outside person that's not directly tied to the event or tied to that person can be a beneficial step. Kim, I don't know if you have anything more on your end to add to that. It's
No,
a
I
challenge.
think that was a great overview. And, we also have our National Victim Connect hotline. And so that would be another resource to connect folks with, to talk with that kind of objective third party. And lots of tips and tricks in the Taking Action Guide that can help kind of give you some language when working with victims.
All right. So these are a couple rules that that FINRA has put in place. Again, I mentioned FINRA is a regulator. These are rules to try and help protect consumers. I'm not going to talk much about it, but we put in a rule that requires brokerage firms to make a reasonable effort to obtain a trusted contact on retail accounts, and that trusted contact essentially serves as an emergency contact if the firm can't reach the customer or they believe that financial fraud or exploitation is occurring. They can leverage that trusted contact. It's not a power of attorney. It's not somebody that has the ability to transact on the account. It's more of like an emergency contact. The other rule that we put into place is a rule that provides brokerage firms, and this kind of goes to that ability that I was talking about, the access of funds. It provides a safe harbor for brokerage firms to place a temporary hold on transactions and disbursements from accounts if they believe that fraud is happening or will occur. It gives them that moment in time to put a pause, because we know once the money goes out, it's hard, if not impossible, to get back. This provides that period of time that they can conduct their investigation. They can reach out to state securities regulators, who are probably one of your best friends when you interact financial fraud, financial exploitation situations. You can reach out to the state securities regulator. They can reach out to FINRA. They can do that investigative process without the money going out. Now, one thing, if you are, say you're in an adult protective service role and you are investigating a case and you find out that assets are held at a brokerage firm or a financial institution, the more you can have an open dialogue with that financial institution, the better results you'll have for that individual. So I know sometimes there's confidentiality that can't fully explain what's going on, but letting that financial institution know that you are looking into a situation could be enough for them to place that hold or to continue to keep that hold in place. All right, so we've talked a lot about financial fraud. We've talked about the emotional impact. What is the future of financial fraud? Well, we're starting to see things continue to evolve. Unfortunately, scammers, fraudsters, they evolve with the time. They look for ways that they can continue to build their financial fraud portfolio, unfortunately. And we're seeing more and more instances where artificial intelligence comes into play. Machine learning is also an area in financial fraud that we're keeping an eye on to see how that's going to continue to evolve. digital assets, kind of that new asset class where people don't necessarily know a lot about. We've seen fraudsters kind of move over to that space because it's an area where, again, people don't know a lot about. Now, that artificial intelligence piece, we're learning more and more and hearing more and more about deep fake technology, about voice cloning that's being used. We're seeing this a lot of times in those grandparent type scams where an individual will get a call, it'll sound like their grandchild, and that person on the other phone will not be the grandchild, but will say, oh, I'm in jail, I need you to send over money, or I need you to send money to my attorney. And the person on the other end of the phone hears that voice of their grandchild that has been cloned, and they act in a way that they might not have acted under different circumstances. So we're starting to see that creep into the landscape more and more frequently.
Thanks, Rob. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the role that we can all play in supporting victims. And we had a few questions come through the Q&A that we're going to cover in this section. Some questions about best steps to be in reporting, the probability of arresting perpetrators, how to talk to people about this that have experienced it. So we'll get into that in these next few slides. One thing that I like to note is believing victims can have a really powerful impact on the victim's resilience and willingness to access additional support and resources. We've talked a little bit about the kind of shame and stigma that comes along with these crimes. And so if you can imagine folks experiencing some of that embarrassment or shame, it might be very difficult to open up and share that they've had these experiences. So as professionals or folks that might interact with potential survivors, we want to be really open to hearing what they're sharing with us and helping empower them to make the best decisions for themselves. So we're going to dive into some best practices using a trauma-informed and strengths-based approach. And we also know, like, you don't need to be a financial expert in order to, help and support survivors. We all can play a role in doing that. Next slide.
All right. So I think Kim kind of alluded, is financial fraud traumatic? Well, what do you all think? It is. And through that story, the Ruth and Len story I told at the beginning, it's traumatic on different levels and it impacts people differently. This slide here was a slide that was put together based on a partnership we have with Give an Hour. And we were able to gather this information off of social posts. So individuals who had been victimized by financial fraud, posting online, combed through all this different online posting to kind of get an idea of what emotions individuals were experiencing and expressing on social media during different times. So we've got the 0 to 3 month post fraud, the 3 to 6 month, the 6 to 9 month, and the 9 to 12 month. And just wanted to kind of show some of those emotions. And there are a wide variety of emotions that are experienced. And it's interesting to see how things kind of change over time. You've got someone that's almost a year away from that fraud experience, and there's still fear, terror, lack of trust, anger. Again, this is almost a whole year after that experience. So it goes to show that there are different stages of this traumatic event when you've been victimized, and there are a lot of different emotions that come into play over time.
Yeah, so recognizing that there's trauma associated with these experiences, we really want to approach all of our interactions in a trauma-informed way. And I'm sure many of you are very familiar with trauma and trauma-informed approaches. So we just wanted to, make sure that we all are on the same page about what this would look like. And so it's important for us to really realize the impact and the signs of trauma, such as all of the feelings that were just listed on that previous slide, right? Things like embarrassment, shame, depression, anxiety, anger, hopelessness. And we want to acknowledge that victims might be reluctant to seek or accept help. And so it's really critical that we ensure our policies and our practices are really trauma informed and that we're building trust and practicing transparency. We're offering them choices and we're empowering those that are impacted. We also want to be mindful of preventing possible re-traumatization, which was something that came up in the Q&A as well. So we're going to explore some strategies in the next few slides. We can move to the next slide. So one of the best ways that we can support survivors is really by setting realistic expectations and being transparent about the financial recovery process. One of the things to know and understand is that financial recovery often takes a lot of time and effort on the victim's part. And unfortunately, financial recovery is pretty rare because, as Rob has mentioned, perpetrators are not often held accountable. They are disposing of assets and pretty quickly, and so they may not necessarily have the funds at the point that they're caught. If they're a stranger, it might be really hard to identify who they are, and they might not even be, physically located in the United States. For cases that are successfully prosecuted, restitution may be an option in those cases, but it's not always possible to get that full payment back again because they may not have that money to pay back. So we know that this can be a really difficult conversation to have with survivors, but doing so upfront can really help to build that trust. And it helps the survivor develop realistic goals. What is recovery and healing going to look like? And I think it's one of the most valuable things that we can do for victims. So if victims are interested in exploring financial recovery, they do have to work with often regulatory, criminal justice, and/or other social service agencies in order to do that. There are lots of resources out there. Before we end the session today, we are going to share quite a few different resources with you. And we also recognize that reporting can be a really helpful tool, both for survivors in accessing help, but it can also be really helpful for regulators. Reporting any type of financial fraud, no matter how small, and even potential fraud, even if a person hasn't engaged with the scam, reporting those things really can help law enforcement, regulators, and government agencies to put a stop to the fraud, prevent the victimization of more consumers, and pursue the perpetrators that are committing fraud. One really helpful resource is the Better Business Bureau. They have a scam tracker online, and so that's a great place for folks to report, potential scams, and for others in the public to be able to go and kind of be informed about current scams that are out there. Victims have the option to report to law enforcement, to the Federal Trade Commission. If the scam or fraud was facilitated through like an online platform, like social media, oftentimes those companies or platforms have a reporting mechanism, and they may also be able to report through their bank. I also like to note that reporting doesn't always mean that there will be a criminal response. And there's also, civil responses such as civil lawsuits that may be available to victims. We know that there are barriers to reporting fraud. And sometimes, even the folks working within those systems, if they are doing great investigations, the system still sometimes has roadblocks to being able to prosecute that crime. So just being aware of like the potential for additional trauma when accessing those systems and processes and helping that person know what to expect can really help them to decide what works best for them. The last thing I want to note here is just helping to reframe recovery to also be about health and well-being. So we know that recovery is not just about finances, but it's also about trauma. And so connecting folks with the appropriate resources, such as counseling or mental health support. Rob mentioned the peer support groups can be a really great resource as well. So we recommend, identifying what those needs might be for each person, connecting them with the appropriate resources, and also being thoughtful about the, financial cost of those resources, such as counseling. Next slide. So just want to touch on this really quickly, but we know that strong relationships and collaborations with our partners is really essential to best supporting survivors and bringing them, these partners in, bring them to the table before we need them. So you may explore, if you aren't familiar, in your own community, if you have a multidisciplinary team. They're sometimes referred to as financial assistance support teams or FAST teams, and getting involved with one of those. And if you aren't able to identify one in your community, you might start exploring, how can we get this, how can we do this in our own locally for, the agencies that we all work with and partner with. So just being really thoughtful to have those relationships in place. It can really help victims get connected faster. We can provide those warm referrals. And it can sometimes be the difference between someone reaching out for more services or staying quiet. Next slide.
All right. I know there was a comment or a question here at some point about how we can talk to victims and survivors without using victim blaming language. Well, here we go. So when we think about individuals that are victims of violent or property crimes, we often react with the notion of, oh, that poor family, what can I do to help? They didn't deserve that. But when it comes to financial crimes, we often react a little bit different. We use words like duped or fell for or were scammed. They must have been stupid to not see that. How could they not know that that was a scam? We use different language, and the language that we use often places blame on the victim. So one of the things that we should do, that we should focus on, is looking for ways to reframe our language. So instead of saying something like, well, if it's too good to be true, we say something like scammers use powerful emotional tactics. We recognize and make the victim understand that they are a victim. They have been targeted by a criminal, by somebody that is looking to exploit them, and reminding them that it's emotional tactics that have been at play. Instead of saying, why did you give your money to a stranger? Well, find out a little bit more information about, so what did the scammer do exactly or say to deceive you and build trust? So you're still getting that same answer. You're just approaching it from a softer side. You're approaching it from a way that's showing empathy, that's empowering the victim, as opposed to implying blame and inspiring shame. Now, this came out of, this was a project that the FINRA Foundation worked on with AARP. We do have more resources on this, the say this, not that work that we did around victim blaming language, and we will include that in the resources that we send after the webinar. All right, moving on to prevention and intervention. So we talked about this a little bit. We know that knowledge is power. The more we talk about scams, the better protected individuals can be. So I encourage you all to make sure that we're talking about and educating individuals on the frauds and the scams that are out there.
Yes, and because knowledge is power, knowing what signs to look for can really help us to intervene and prevent financial fraud. So this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but just to give you an idea of some things that we can be aware of to kind of give us a sense of, is something wrong? Be aware of unusual or irregular withdrawals or transfers from accounts, or things like large credit card purchases, or even purchasing large amounts in gift cards. And so we often see this in the form of Apple iTunes gift cards, right? If someone's purchasing $300, $400, $500 gift cards in one transaction, that might be a potential warning sign. The next bullet point here, while new relationships are not always an indicator of fraud, if a new relationship is developing very quickly, if the person has not met this person physically in person, if there's a constant presence of a new party, or the person begins asking for money, these might be signs that something is wrong. We want to be aware of changes to finances, property, or a person's technology. And if someone becomes withdrawn or isolated from family and friends without a really clear reason, it might indicate that someone is targeting them. Next slide. Again, we don't need to be financial experts in order to help support survivors and victims get the support and resources they need. There are plenty of tools, organizations, and resources to help you navigate this. We know that safety planning is often necessary in cases of financial fraud, and there are some really great resources from both the National Domestic Violence Hotline and the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, which we will show in one of our later slides. They have some great safety planning strategies and resources, and so I recommend that folks look at those. There's some good technology safety planning checklists out there. And so those can really help to guide your safety plan. And, as we've talked about, having those really good relationships with our partners to ensure we can make those warm referrals. And we talked about reporting as well. Next slide. So since we have such limited time together today, we are not going to explore in depth these action plans, but we have developed recovery checklists for 4 different types of fraud. And they provide specific, breakdown of specific action steps and ways that you can help. And so this is a really great resource that is available on our website. Next slide. Just a few things to note in terms of how we can help to prevent future victimization and things that we can incorporate into our prevention, education, or outreach efforts. We want to encourage folks to be cautious when financial or investment opportunities arise, especially if they're unsolicited. We encourage folks not to participate in or respond to foreign lotteries or sweepstakes, especially if they don't remember entering them. Being cautious when dealing with individuals and companies from outside your own country. Making sure that folks inquire about all the terms and conditions and shred suspicious mail and not respond to junk mail or emails from strangers. Make sure you're doing your research on the person, the company, or the opportunity, looking, online. I saw some great resources being shared in the chat. So just being really careful about that and always, seeking advice from trusted financial professionals or other, trusted people in your life. Being cautious of really time-sensitive, urgent things or times where someone is threatening something. For example, if they're saying, there's a warrant out for your arrest if you don't pay this immediately, or we're going to take some kind of legal action if you don't pay this. So just things to be aware of. Since we're getting close to time, I want us to be able to share some resources with you and maybe answer a few of your questions. So we can move into our next section. So we've talked about the Taking Action Guide throughout, and I believe the link has been added to the chat a couple of times. This is a really great holistic resource that can help you understand the different types of fraud. It goes over some prevention tips, how to best support individuals. There's a guide on who to report to and how to report. And also additional resources. So really recommend you check that out. Next slide, please. I've mentioned our Victim Connect Resource Center. This is our national hotline available to victims of any type of crime. So we encourage folks to get connected for emotional support, information, and referrals. We can move to the next slide.
Right, I mentioned the Cybercrime Support Network and their support group for romance scam survivors. Their website is fightcybercrime.org. So if you know somebody that has been victimized, they can go through, or you can go through and register them for this group, where it's a 10-week program where they go through and have weekly sessions to help move forward after the scam or after the fraud has occurred. I also mentioned one of our partners, Give an Hour. Here is their website, giveanour.org/financial fraud. I mentioned that they had that peer support program. They also have provider training and continuing to have great pieces come out from our partnership with them. So if you have an individual that has been victimized by financial fraud, they have a peer support program as well. There's been a few comments in there. Thank you, Leslie, and hi. Thank you for for mentioning broker check. This here is broker check. This allows you to look up the registration of an individual because, yes, if a person is acting in a position where they're selling securities, they need to be registered. If they're working in the securities industry, they need to be registered. So you can use broker check to verify information and verify the person was registered, how long they've been in the industry, if they have any disciplinary history. You can also look at firms, and you can see information for firms as well. One of the great things about the firm tab, so up here you can see individual and firm. If you look up a specific firm, there's actually going to be a phone number under there where you can call that firm to verify information if you need to. I know there's the comment about imposter scams. Brokerage firms are not immune to that. Individuals that work for brokerage firms are not immune. So if a person says that they're registered and they work for a registered company and they're selling a product that seems odd, you can call that firm based on the number in there and verify that information. There's a ton of resources that FINRA has. So we have our finrafoundation.org/fraudfighter content. You are going to find a lot of our information that's going to be more of our research information for advocates. So folks like you all, you will find on our FINRA Foundation website. We also have our FINRA website, which is finra.org/investors. That's going to be more investor-focused content. There was a comment in the chat about resources and webinars and things like that for seniors. We have a lot of great resources on our finra.org/investor site, including articles that are written about different products and trends that we're seeing. I also mentioned our securities helpline. That is a number that you should write down. That is 844-574-3577. If anybody has questions or concerns about securities-related questions or concerns, reach out to that number. A dedicated staff will be there to help answer questions, point people to resources, and look into certain allegations and concerns.
There is a national elder abuse hotline, so that is a helpful resource to know about if you have questions specific to elder abuse. And that number is there on the screen for you. Next slide, please. And the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, they are not a direct service provider, but they do offer training, technical assistance, and resources, and they're great, just a great resource if you want to learn more. Another list of resources that we've mentioned throughout our time together today, there's the Federal Trade Commission or FTC Report Fraud Portal. I know Rob talked about the Cybercrime Support Network. There are resources on debt collection listed there. We've talked about the Elder Fraud Hotline, and our portal also has plenty of information on any training and technical assistance needs you might have. I think that brings us to the end. There's our contact information.
So if there are, specific questions you have, you want some additional information, additional resources, please feel free to reach out to us. We are more than happy to hear from you afterwards. I'm going to look here through the chat and the Q&A, see what else we have to cover. I'm also going to put in the chat the Given Hour website for their program. I have already put in Cybercrime Support Network. And there is the givenhour.org/financial fraud. Hopefully you all have found this information helpful. It's kind of a teaser, right? So there's a lot of information to cover. We can't go into detail in an hour on everything, but we wanted to be able to give just a high-level overview to get you all to start thinking about our Taking Action guide. And if you have questions, please do reach out to us. We are happy to chat with you afterwards.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming.